Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me back yet again the dark, evil wizard, Nathaniel Cumberledge. How are you doing, Nathaniel? Oh, can you pronounce your name today? How are you doing, Nate?
I'm doing just fine. Fine enough to do this.
Yeah, that's about as fine as you can be, right? Um, Thank you again for coming back, Nate. This time we're going to be talking about setting. I think this is going to be a fun conversation, and I'm kind of glad that it got, let's say, passed down to about midway through the topics because the other topics that we've covered before on the Wild Isle writing cast will, I think, let's say, I don't want to use the word synergize, that's the wrong word, but they will become relevant, and we'll see as we develop onward. But before we begin, I have the usual and unusual announcements. So by the time this releases, I think it will have been over, but I have a Kickstarter running. So just in case for some reason this comes out and the Kickstarter is still up, which I don't think will be, doesn't matter. The point is, actually, no, the Kickstarter will be up when this comes out. Sorry, I've recorded a bunch of podcasts. So the Kickstarter is for Smoke Tales from the Labyrinth. It is a short story collection in the Smoke series. It's like a spin-off sequel to Broken, the book I have out now, which you can find on my website, wildidelit.com. I am raising money for the covers because I'll be releasing the stories in batches and then all together as a collection. But that means I need 5 book covers, and 5 book covers is 5 book covers more than I can afford. So if you would like to help me get these stories to publication, go over to my website. There's a gigantic picture. You can click on it. It'll take you to the Kickstarter page. If you don't have spare cash to support or donate, do not worry. Just please share the link around as far and wide as you can, and that will help out plenty. Thank you so much for that. And while you're there, if you are an author, check out my editing page, the Wild Isle Style Guide, where I offer my editing services focusing on the stylistic considerations of prose, really harkening back to the days of pulp, but also some of the newer stuff. Things like Cormac McCarthy was a big inspiration for me, but I also like, like Mark Twain and such. So if you like classics and modern and weird postmodern works all together stylistically, you can hire me there. I also focus in on theme, and you can get plenty of that. And you'll notice that during the podcast. I already mentioned my book. Is there anything else I want to shill? Not quite today. Oh, last thing, don't want to forget, if you want to appear on this podcast, you can, or if you have a topic to recommend, you can do that too over at wildidelit.com/contact or through any like social media. That works as well. Get a hold of me that way, recommend a topic. We're getting recommendations all the time, and it's great. Your guys' ideas are excellent, and I would love to talk to more and more authors to spread our names around and develop the conversation with a diverse range of ideas. All right, Nate, do you have anything you want to shill?
Your most recent collection has a cactus man, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I quite like Cactus Man. His name is Runs in the Sun. If you are the rare person who might have seen a stream done by my friends, we were playing Morrowind online. I was role playing my Cactus Man Runs in the Sun. So, without further ado, let's get into the topic of the podcast today, and that is setting. So, Nate, as always, we should start out by defining our terms. When I say the word setting in regard to fiction, what comes to mind for you?
The trappings and time and place generally of your of the at least the atmosphere or environment of the story. Setting doesn't setting has often has more to do with flavor than the story itself because most people tend to write character driven stories, and a lot of character driven stories are easily transplantable across multiple spaces. So to me it's most, unless you're writing something like historical or something like that, it's generally mostly flavor and trappings. But
Okay. So that
go
was good.
ahead.
So you essentially defined trappings there because I have in the typical academic definition for setting is time and place, but I do like the addition of trappings because, and we'll discuss that. I have that down on the list in the notes. When setting is mere background dressing or mere trappings, and when it is an integral element to other elements of the story. But I think it's worth expanding actually. So when I taught at university courses, uh, I would get to setting in my literature classes, and like the chapter on setting was teeny tiny. It was almost no text, and I thought that was a real shame because the words time and place have in and of themselves a lot of significance, right? Um, so if I say that a story is set within a particular time, Nate, what comes to mind to you? Like, what do you think is going to be relevant to the aspect of time in regard to setting?
The level of development of the societies involved, for the most part, the cultural, socio-economic conditions are also very relevant because sometimes a story set in like 500 BC can only be told in that time versus a story that's set in the here and now can only be told in this moment in time and be relevant to a people. But sometimes the story is so universal that the setting doesn't matter, but it's highly variable based on execution and theme.
Yeah, in particular, when it with regard to culture, I think that is very much the case, right? Because a culture, and I have culture written down as one of the two major variables for time, but that is going to dictate the values. And it is true that there are universal values, but there are also parochial values, right? Like the classic example that comes up on the podcast quite a lot is the difference between, let's say, the modern idea of hero and, like, let's say, the ancient Greek idea of hero, right? Those are very different. And so um, you're going to, depending on when the story is set, you you could transplant those, but it's going to feel anachronistic, and to some people, it might offend their sensibilities, right? Like if you read an ancient hero in the modern era, some people are going to cry and bitch and moan and whine about it because it doesn't fit their modern idea of what a hero is. Um, and I'm sure vice versa, the ancients would have just, not been very impressed with the heroes of our modern era. And so the time definitely matters. What about technology though?
Especially in stuff like science fiction, technology plays a very big role. If your story is like a really well researched, uh, speculative hypothesis about how like commerce and merchant guilds of the asteroid belt would function, for example. But
Are we
so yeah,
talking about Dune?
technology. Yeah, just like not specifically Dune, but that same sort of vibe. Like this is a very like well thought out future society that takes into account all of our technological advances, or even, you know, in Dune's case, like regressions in a lot of ways. Because Dune, despite being in the future, is also a very like medieval or Bronze Age story in a sense,
Yeah, if I
but it's
remember
still in the
right.
future.
Yeah, I remember right. They banned certain technologies because, like, I think artificial intelligence is banned in Dune, which is why they need the mentats. Is that right?
Yes. So they banned artificial intelligence not because like the typical trope of robot rebellion or anything, but they felt like collectively, like the religious organizations of humanity felt like technology was making us too lazy and we weren't fulfilling our potential and we were just stagnating. So we all just decided eventually as a species to throw away robots.
Yeah, well, I mean that's kind of a major theme. As a result of the setting, right? Like the Sardaukar are from like this desolate, terrible planet where they like everything is awful, and that's what makes them like the best warriors, and they can only be opposed by the space Muslims who live in space Saudi Arabia.
An even
Um,
worse planet, yes.
yeah. Um, but also, I think there could be smaller differences with technology that actually can have a large impact on the story. This is why I actually think setting as trapping There are many examples of it, but I think we take for granted a lot of aspects. So, like technology, for example. Now, if I say something is set in the contemporary modern era, particularly within the past 100 years, that doesn't mean a lot, right? So, um, if something is set right now with smartphones versus set 20 years ago where you have cell phones but not really smartphones versus if you go back 20 years before that where you have phones and then you go back far enough before that and like the ability for people to communicate, you know, that changes quite a lot of how the story can progress, how the characters are going to solve problems, and I don't want to get too deep into that because that's how setting kind of touches in on plot. But um, what do you think of the significance of, let's say, the small bits of technology that suddenly start to impact other aspects of the plot like that? Like just thinking of like the development of computers and phones in the past,
I would
I don't know, 100 years.
I would say that as far as character-driven stories, communication technology is probably one of the biggest ones, but it also has the widest setting implications a lot of the time, the changes in communication technology. One example is I'm almost done with it. I started reading a little bit ago Space Viking by H. Beam Piper, who discusses how eventually in the future we developed like fast and light travel for spaceships, but we never developed a way to communicate fast and light. So space became super localized, and due to the lack of communication technology, planets became very self-contained. Because the only time you were able to get a message to anybody or communicate anything was if you could send somebody out to deliver a thing directly. So there was no central government, and people were pretty independent. And also more contemporary, well, more history based. The Wild West was probably largely settled by the introduction of railroads and the telegraph in particular, because being able to disseminate the will of Washington to the other side of the country in like no time flat was a huge deal in maintaining the civility of developing settlements,
Yeah,
especially
that's super. Go ahead.
I was going to say, especially since a lot of cowboys and a lot of the stereotypical like heroes of Western stories, and of course in real life, were ex-Confederates who were trying to escape the thumb of the Union after the war. So it's the concern of those people eventually developing communities and rebelling was very real.
Yeah, that's super interesting because like what we've done there is we've kind of outlined just so far we're mostly talking about time and time's relation to technology and then how that technology both relates to culture, but then also how um it's not linear. So like as technology expands, like sometimes it creates a kind of what we're used to now, right? The idea of nation states and like a kind of broader order or even international global level orders because of our communication technologies. But if you went too far, then the communication gets outpaced by other forms of transportation, let's say, like if you have light speed transportation. And so what that would mean is that you could go so far in time with technology that it actually regresses and you get something interesting off the back end of that. Um, and that kind of leads us to environment too, right? Because that's kind of where you left off, where as you expand out west, you've got all these essentially exiles, right? If not exiles, self-imposed exiles, and that's the other aspect of setting, right? The environment. Um, we mentioned that a little bit with Dune, right? So like you've got the harshness of a desert planet making a people into hardy warriors who were extremely disciplined and had very rigorous hierarchical societies because that was a product of their setting, right? Can you think of any other examples in which um, the environment is like a really big component to setting?
One example of something that I've read is of the decadent city state of Melniboné from Elric of Melniboné. The setting definitely influences. It's like a highly urbanized thalassocracy in the middle of the ocean that, due to their state of security and years of supremacy, have led them to become very soft, decadent people. And they're a big part of the exploration of the early stories, well, especially the first one, is how this bored noble aristocracy that used to rule the world passes their time with hedonism, drugs, and trying to search for meaning in what they could perceive as a meaningless world. So the opposite end of the coin from the Dune, Sardaukar, Fremen divide there, but in a fantasy story.
Yeah, that reminds me a bit. To kind of take a different angle. So in my own work on One Smoke Broken, you start out in this village south. And to speak of environment, it's like on the border of civilization, right? There's this poison acidic mist that prevents people from settling too far north of the village. And essentially what you have is a village of miserable, what would you call them? Like 18th, maybe early 19th century coal miners, and so they're all like alcoholics eating these mushrooms delved out by this cave dweller in order to deal with the fact they all have like black lung and their backs are all bowed over from crawling through tiny tunnels. Um, and that produces a kind of environment. Like obviously, I took that from West Virginia. For those of you who don't know, that's where I grew up, right? So this idea of the environment being this kind of it has some resources, but it um, does not foster the, let's say, the technological development that you might see, and so you can play around with how setting produces the characters, and then what those characters are going to be like, and that produces the society and the culture, which in turn affects both like religion and government, right? So playing off of let's say setting even more. So I'll take One Smoke. It is essentially a bunch of they're not quite city states. They're more like at one point a federated kingdom that wasn't a kingdom before, which is how it ended up like a federated city state kingdom. But then the kingdom collapsed, and so now you have these individual um, I guess you'd call them communities, towns, villages, some as large as cities that because of the governance that was set up by the prior monarch before the rapid fall of that monarch. So they didn't have a revolution; they just had like a kind of like a collapse of the system before. So they're operating off of this skeletal system, and different cities have different, let's say, prominent what's the word? Authoritative figures. Like one is very religious because they were the settlers from the Puritans who came over with the conquering people. Some of them are quite decadent because of essentially being forward in time due to an advance in technology, which changes their society and their government to essentially be this, let's say, totalitarian um, nanny state is the best way to describe it, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how just by changing those elements of time and place, or relative time and place, or a better way to say it is relative technology and environment, you produce different societies, religions, and governments, and that is what we kind of call culture. Now, that's all rather significant. What we haven't really talked about are stories where the setting is mere background, mere trappings, mere, dressing, an ornament. There we go. So I had to say the word like 20 times. Are there any examples, Nate, you can think of where the background or the setting is just background, like it doesn't have significant impacts on the plot or the characters or the theme?
I'm going to go ahead and cite the story I am currently reading again, although I did discuss how technology radically altered how that civilization functions. The characters and their story is a very feudal one because it was there was a weird kick in the 1950s and 60s of writing like futuristic stories that had feudalism in it. So there was like the central plot is like this quarrel between two royal families over this marriage, and then they assassinate and like all this stuff. I'm not going to go a blow by blow, but the idea is this story could have happened in like medieval France with no changes, and that it's interesting that a story can uh, just have this highly transplantable thing across time and space, but have these environmental conditions that can justify the trapping transference, I guess. I
Yeah.
guess that might
There's a
that might have made
question
it a
though.
bad example because there's justification there, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask about actually, because even in that case, it's transplantable, but it's not universally transplantable. It's like you can jump to this really far future, or you can jump to medieval France. But if you go to like modern America, suddenly that might not work anymore, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But this
yeah.
this
So
goes into another argument where I'm going to make is that like as far as people who write adventure fiction or like stuff of that nature, I think there are certain environmental conditions required to make most of the stories that people write in that specific genre work. I know that this is just a general writing thing, but I feel like most of the people that listen to this and most of us talking primarily write adventure fiction. So it leans into things that are more lawless, like settings that are more lawless and more of a frontier most of the time, or at least an anarchic state where the state exists but just doesn't care about anybody. Because this gives room for like smaller characters to make bigger contributions to the world. Because when there's no like big daddy government to get in the way of characters quarreling or engaging each other in some kind of feud or faffery, it it feels more intimate and more personal. So that's why things like feudal, medieval stuff, the Wild West, space frontiers, and all that are such popular settings for the type of fiction we tend to write and read.
absolutely, that reminds me. I've been reading through. It's taking forever because it's super long. The novel Musashi, and assuming that and it seems to be fairly realistic, the depiction of feudal Japan. And it's as if there aren't police. Like I know that the local lord might have some dudes like as retainers that could serve as police if he decided to send them out. But the amount of times where it's like someone just ends up dead in the morning, and then everyone's like, "Oh well, uh, we don't know who did this," or like we don't want to, I don't want to be the guy who sticks his neck out and like gets cut down with the same dude who cut this other dude down. Um, but that's only possible because of the relative, let's say, level of technology that and environment that allows for that freedom. Whereas if you have, modern day restrictions, if I shoot someone, there's like a decent chance. It's not as high as we would think, but a decent chance that like essentially you're just going to get caught by the police. You end up in a court system. You don't really have any choices that you can make after that. So unless I want to write like a modern thriller where the whole plot is like I'm running away from the police because I shot this guy, um, you can't really do the same kind of story. And even then, like I think of Blood Meridian, right? So a bunch of the characters in Blood Meridian, I know Toadvine is one. I think Bathcat. There's other ones. They're on the lam, and a big part of the plot is that they are in this gang purely so they can keep pushing west as far as they could go to essentially get away from their crimes, which spoiler alert, like they don't get away. Uh for a number of reasons, and not all of them is by the law that catches up with them. But that story, the motivations for those characters is certainly produced um by the setting. Um and then we talked about genre, right? So on this podcast, I've criticized the modern use of genre. So, um, why do I bring that up? Well, because I'm going to refer to the typical uses of genre, and I want to discuss genre and setting in terms of how they relate to each other. Because I think here we're going to find that I think I'm essentially going to try and justify my position, but I think that we're going to find that oftentimes we call certain settings genres because of the exact relationship that we just described. Because certain settings produce certain plot types and they produce certain motivations for characters. And then that in turn will produce certain themes, right? And so then we end up describing those things because they are interrelated as being in and of itself a genre. Um, and we'll see if that bears out and whether that's an inevitability, right? I might have to, by the end of this, walk back my critique of genre as telos and instead refer back to the typical thing. So let's start with speculative fiction because we're both speculative fiction writers. I think most of the listeners are going to be speculative fiction readers as well if they don't write it themselves. So it's like science fiction fantasy essentially. Um, so what what impacts would we say? We might have already kind of gone over this. What impacts would we say that setting has specifically on um, the genre of let's say speculative fiction, sci-fi fantasy. Like, is there a distinction from the genre and the setting at all? Really?
Uh, it, the thing about speculative fiction, especially during like its golden age, is that it can be highly variable how like setting and genre interact. But also it was all there was a period that it was a lot more fluid. So like you could have like the trappings of a fantasy story, but in like the 31st century and dealing with technologies that you wouldn't associate with that time. Like, um, lost my train of thought with that one. But I don't think that there's a like hard marriage between setting and genre necessarily. But I'm glad you're using you use the term speculative fiction because I feel like the shared ancestry of fantasy and sci-fi is often underappreciated, which we've talked about before.
Yeah, essentially, the delineation, because my argument really is that speculative fiction, I would like to get it out from underneath the genre and into setting. And why do I make that argument? Well, we just talked about what setting is. It's the technology, it's the environment, and the productive society, religion, and government of that. Now, next to technology, I don't see why something like fantastical or magical or supernatural elements don't fit in exactly the same spot. Um, and I have down in my notes a section on world building and hard versus soft world building, but essentially technology in the same way like I'm sure most listeners will be familiar with the terms hard and soft magic systems, and if you're not, well, if you search it up you're going to go down a rabbit hole because people talk about that endlessly. I think Brandon Sanderson is the reason for that, but I have not read his works or listened to his lectures, so I do not know. However, the idea that, let's say, science fiction technology, as plausible as it sounds, is anything different than magic fundamentally in terms of fiction, seems silly to me. And so all of a sudden, that aspect of time, which is technology in relationship to setting, just if we accept that there's no real difference between, let's say, speculative technology and speculative magic, fundamentally to the writing of fiction, then my question is, if technology is an aspect of setting, why does fantasy and science fiction, those elements, why do those not get swallowed up by setting? Can you think of a reason why they shouldn't be swallowed up by setting?
Um, that's a good question. I don't
Yeah, I could.
think that there's anything inherent about. Yeah, okay. So I think the idea of speculative fiction being swallowed up by setting is probably because there's nothing inherent. Like genre is about plot and character, right? But there's nothing inherent to speculative fiction to plot and character necessarily. I mean, it can be, but That's getting into like, is the story about the setting? Is the story about like the science or the magic system per se? Well, you see that more commonly in hard science fiction, right? Where how people react to the technology is the story.
Yeah. So in that case, so I think this is really where, in relationship to setting, it's really useful to think of genre as telos, right? So if I want to, let's say, cause a sense of intrigue or cause a sense of horror or excitement, like a kind of a thriller would, um, I could those are all feelings, experiences that the reader can get. And I can use setting along with plot, along with character, those other elements to produce those feelings in the reader to different degrees and to different primacy, right? So I can use a speculative science fiction or fantasy setting, or an urban fantasy setting, or a contemporary setting, or a historical setting, or a super futuristic space setting that feels very much like feudal Europe. I can do all those things. And with each of those things, depending on how I balance those setting elements with the plot elements and character elements, um, I can produce different feelings in the reader, right? And I think that that is a much more coherent way of thinking than saying like, okay, or like if I like, particularly if I use like historical fantasy or historical fiction as being a genre. But then my question is, okay, well, that tells me that the bit of fiction is set in a real historical time and place, but that doesn't tell me literally anything else. And so as a genre, I'm like, what is the word even doing? Right? It does something in setting, tells me where it's set, and that might tell me about the plot and the characters, but that doesn't tell me about how it's going to make me feel as a reader at all.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think a more useful like categorization of story is both setting and genre like together, because like just saying this is a fantasy story or this story is set in this time and place say absolutely nothing. So, but two things together. So this is a science fiction detective story set on colonial Mars says a lot more. And it's
Yeah,
just
and
a
I think
combination of a few more words.
yeah, that's exactly what I'm going for actually, right? So like so I think detective story, right? That might be talking about plot, right? Because I think there's different plot types. The detective story, fundamentally, the conflict revolves around a mystery. Okay, that tells the reader a lot, right? There's like a you can reliably if you want to read a mystery or detective story, like it's if you picked one up or if you didn't, right? Because of the way
Yeah,
the plot resolves. If you say it's like a science fiction detective story set on Mars, okay, it tells you that it tells you the technology and the environment, and it tells you how the plot's going to develop. Maybe it doesn't tell you too much about the characters, but you still have a lot of information. Now, I think you might add a word like thriller to that, right? Like, because I know you've mentioned the term to me before, techno thriller, right?
yes.
Okay,
Well,
so
techno thriller is a subgenre of like modern, typically modern thriller that focuses on the cutting edge of real technologies. This was a term coined whenever they were initially critiquing the genre that Tom Clancy more or less invented, which is like cutting edge Cold War technologies and spy thrillers and stuff.
yeah, but that actually tells you a lot, though. Like
Yes.
as much as that might have just come from a critique, particular of Tom Clancy. Like if I say techno thriller, okay, I know technology is going to be, um, at least for the time it was written in, pushing on the edge. So it's speculative, but it's near future or like modern speculative technology. Thriller, I know there's going to be action. I'm good, and with that action is going to be there to give me a feeling of thrill and excitement, hence the name, right? Um,
Yeah.
and I think we could do that we could combine those different, let's say functions. I like the word function because it strips the subjectivity out. The function of the book or the primary function of the book to most people. Um, because I had legitimate critique. Well, it's like, well, not every book reads the same way to everyone, and that's true. And I would also say not every medicine affects everyone the same way. But like, if you have an infection, like maybe penicillin is a good idea, even though it might not work for you. Like, might if you're gonna die, you're gonna take the penicillin. Why? Because like it might help. Um,
Yeah, if a story is supposed to be a comedy and you don't find it funny at all, that doesn't make that story not. It was the intention for it to be a comedy.
well, even if it wasn't, right? Like, let's say the intention wasn't for it to be a comedy, and it ended up being a comedy because the person, like, would say, wrote it in such a way that they just ended up writing the opposite of what they wanted, and like 99% of people think it's funny, and then you're like the one person with no sense of humor. That doesn't You know what I mean? Like that doesn't make it not funny and not a comedy. Um, if Dave Chappelle gets up and tells a joke and someone's offended because of their politics or something, that doesn't make him not a comedian, and that doesn't make the joke not funny. Because when he gets up in front of an audience, he evokes laughter consistently from the audience. And so there's
Yeah.
something objective there because he can reliably produce that effect in the context that the joke was written in. So so that's getting kind of far in a field. But I did want to spend some time there because I really think that a lot of what we call genre isn't genre. I think it's setting, and I think genre is how the work makes you feel. And I think it would be, as authors and readers, we would be able to communicate with each other about fiction way better if we understood the difference between those concepts, right? Between setting and between genre and between plot types, right? Like that's why there's such a thing as what is it like romantic fantasy? So like a romance story, romance fiction set in a fantasy setting. Like there's tons and tons and tons of this. Um, and that tells you something, right? It's romantic. It's meant to, let's say, the plot centers around a romantic relationship. It's assumedly made to, if it's like a romantic comedy, made make you feel kind of heartwarmed and happy because of the union of the characters, whatever you want to call it. So you could have like a romantic comedy fantasy story, and that tells you a lot, like a lot more than just I don't know like how else you would try and to label it.
Yeah, I think just the idea of subgenre, or like that's usually what people tend to call it, should be more of the default of labeling something, because I, for one, am a big fan of increasingly specific subgenre categorizations, which has become kind of like a trend in certain communities discussing fiction. Like you were saying, like this person who specifically seeks out and enjoys, or like romantic fantasy, which is a very specific thing. Well, not less specific than what I'm thinking of, but also a good example of this that is like this in title but not in execution is steampunk, which is like, that name says a lot about what the setting should be, but most people just tend to ignore the latter part of it. Uh, because like steam implies a Victorian-esque setting, but slightly more technological, based on like uh a branch off of technological development that focuses more on like speculative Jules Verne-esque stuff. But the punk part is supposed to imply like seedier characters in a more criminal environment, which tends to get ignored. But I went
Yeah.
off on a tangent there. But
No, it's okay. So, we talked a lot about setting in regard to genre just now, and we covered it a bit with plot, right? So, um, let's say, for instance, if you have a mystery, uh, a mystery plot, he was calling them plot structures. I think plot type because I think they all share the same structure at the base, but the categorization or the typology of the plot events fit variable patterns. So, like mystery would be one, romance would be one. I think adventure, that's like the hero's journey. That definitely seems to be one. Um, Setting can affect those like quite a lot. Like we mentioned communication technology, and like you could ruin a mystery story in like 2 seconds by putting it in the wrong setting, I think. Unless you
Oh,
take a bunch of considerations to like rewrite the whole story. Um, I think you
yeah,
could probably,
or
yeah,
you would have to probably tie the technology into like the into the problem, right? So like Minority Report, Philip K. Dick. So like the fact that people can preemptively solve crimes is part of the crux of the conflict.
yeah, and that reminds me again. We go back to Dune with like the shields, right? Like in order to make and the abandonment of AI, like there's a bunch of things in Dune that when you really look at it, what they are there for is to make the feudal politics work in the sci-fi setting, because otherwise it's just weird. Like you can't really very very well sell this whole space Muslim thing unless you have a reason for like knife fighting to be a thing where people have like laser guns. Uh, you know, um,
Yeah.
so I think setting does, even when we try to make it mere trappings, I think inevitably it ties into the plots. That's I would say like adventure even, right? So depending on how easy or hard it is to travel, that really determines whether you can have an adventure story, right? I think that's why you don't see that many modern you wouldn't see like a modern urban adventure story for instance, right? Like the urban aspect of it kind of murders the adventure, I think, because of how easy it is to get around an urban setting. Like you either have public transport, you have your own car, things are built on top of each other so you can just walk over there.
Yeah, I
It
mean, this is certainly true in the Western world, but you could write a story about like a security team taking a businessman to Mogadishu, and suddenly, if something goes bottoms up there, it becomes an urban adventure story pretty quickly of
yeah,
them
and
trying to
it's
like get out of this hyper violent urban environment of these different factions trying to kill them.
yeah, fair enough with that, right? Because urban, it doesn't tell you that much, right? Because it tells you about the technology, but it doesn't tell you about the place, the environment.
Hmm.
So that's an aspect of setting. But then again, that's another aspect of setting that determines what plot types really, really work. Uh, this could even be true um, for like romantic subplots, let's say. I'm going to give it a shout out to Michael H, aka Eternus, aka Captain. Um, he's been on the podcast before. I've read some of the fiction he's working on. I won't want to spoil any of his work, so I won't. But what I will say is that there are elements of his setting that affect the way that characters think about romantic relationships, and they make certain, let's say, complications in a romantic subplot. Some of them they make relevant, and some they make irrelevant in the same way that like Dune makes certain things from like the feudal age come back and other things go away. So I think, like for instance, if you have um, the like if arranged marriages and extremely ordered like expectations and hierarchical systems that determine like your life outcomes, and then also let's say that uh, yeah, well, let's just use those. That's going to affect how characters relate to one another. Um, and so if you've got your male female pair up lead, right? How they interact and what you expect as a reader and what can and cannot be delivered, and how that's going to let's say how that conflict that subplot conflict is going to resolve even at that level, right? Something with like romance that definitely gets influenced, which is pretty significant because that's actually fairly universal, right? Like the way that two human beings relate to each other at the level of like romantic interest goes all the way down to like our base biology. Otherwise, like you wouldn't reproduce. So um, I think that's actually that's fairly interesting to note. What about character, right? Like so setting and its influence on characters and how those characters are motivated, how they think and feel, what those characters value. I think there's a lot. There's a lot here. Um, are there any
Yeah.
particular examples that pop into your mind?
Um. Let me think. So like a lot of the tougher characters in the contemporary fiction of like the 50s, pretty much all of them were in World War II by virtue of them being, we got to have an excuse of why this guy has all this experience and why he's such a tough guy and stuff. And then, it's the 50s, everybody's just coming out of World War II, and a lot of like the audience for these stories were also there, so they kind of see themselves in the plot. So that's an example of where time and place of both when it was written and when it's set can kind of inform why the story is the way it is. So like that was very common in like especially thriller and detective fiction to have this like uh former paratrooper turned detective in the hard streets of Los Angeles or whatever. So that's one example. And
Yeah,
of course,
per-
the Conan the Barbarian is also very informed by his setting. He is a wilderness-born individual who grew up in a super tough, rugged environment, who comes to the civilizations of the Hyborians and is like he has a leg up on them because he has had to live an eternally difficult life while most of them have had much softer experiences.
yeah, you get a certain to the character's capabilities. Um, Also, like what their value. So Conan is a good example, and then I want to talk about Musashi again. So with Conan, um, he is often a thief. He is often a mercenary. Sometimes he's just an adventurer. He's been a pirate, but all of these things come from the, you know, rather decentralized, expansive world where you can, one, you can get away with crimes, uh, and that, and there's a world to explore, and there are lost ancient civilizations where the loot hasn't already all been pulled out of the ground. Now we live in like the post-colonial world where basically the powers of Europe got the chance to plunder all of the like ancient lost treasures of ancient civilizations that were either buried under the ground or just left sitting there by the natives who didn't think they were valuable. That happened a lot. That's how if your stuff ended up in a British museum, um, post-colonial countries, it's because unfortunately your more recent ancestors didn't realize the significance of what your more ancient ancestors had, and the British showed up, and then like your more recent ancestors were like, whatever, I don't care about this. So that's why that happened. Uh, but yeah, with Conan, you have to have a world where you can get in trouble with the law. I bring the story up a lot, Queen of the Black Coast, I think it is. But I really love that story. At the very beginning, um, let's say Conan, he was out drinking with a buddy, and the buddy's girl, like some town guard, started hitting on his buddy's girlfriend. So his buddy killed the dude, um, and Conan thought this was perfectly reasonable. Now the buddy skipped town, but Conan stuck around and he gets arrested. And they're questioning him in court, and he's like, "Look, I'm not going to rattle my friend. For one thing, he's my friend. So even if he did the wrong thing, I'm not going to tell you. But also, I think what he did was perfectly reasonable." Uh, and then essentially after this really great line where like the judge talked like basically scolded him about civil responsibilities and other things that Conan didn't understand. It was like essentially a paraphrase of the line. He like cuts his way past the guards, gets on a ship and like GTFO, right? Um, you couldn't do that outside of the setting that allows for it, you know? Uh, it kind of makes
It's
you
hard to
long
do
for that.
that. No, yeah, it's kind of hard to do that in a country with the FBI.
Yeah, and I think the same thing with Musashi. So with Musashi, i- there's this. He was in this time and place in Japan, in which people really could. It was before everyone got really soft. Like you just started to see the softening of certain schools because they just finished a war, and like during the time of the war, all the warriors are like super battle hardened. But they were going through some transformations. But this was a time where um, a a person could, that stereotype of like the traveling Ronin, like who lives out in the wood and wanders from town to town, and is like challenging people and getting famous as a swordsman. If you don't set it in that particular time in Japan, with the culture that they had, like the particular honor culture and the fact that lineage was very important, and that they have all this influence from Confucianism and Taoism and Zen Buddhism to like pursue a way. And so just the fact that you're really good at a thing, whatever that thing is, like suddenly gains this respect that affords you a living, even if it's kind of weird. Like to a modern person, it's like, why does anyone care about this vagrant Musashi? But then from the context of the setting, it's like when some master artist merchant, who is like a painter and a sculptor, um, like sees this other guy who also has mastered this art, they immediately have this respect for one another because of that idea of, he is also an adherent of the way. uh, because they kind of have a common religious cultural background. So that's another way that setting can really affect what kind of characters you can have. Like you really can't have um, a Musashi in the way that he is depicted in that story. Like you could still have like, oh, some super skilled badass swordsman, but you don't have the same character. Like with Conan, you have this lawless barbarian who has this disregard with the civilizations he's in. With Musashi, what you have is a wild child grown up who is, let's say, in his own way, seeking enlightenment as a redemption for what he feels like up to that point was a wasted life after basically being scolded by Takuan. So and there's a lot more relatability there, but you can't with Musashi. Like if he was just some random, a random badass swordsman, um, like I say, myself as a writer couldn't relate to him as much. But as someone who is trying to seek like his particular way in the world and to live by the way that he feels will bring him to essentially his potential enlightened self. Now you can switch enlightenment with like fulfilling one's telos or purpose, and it's like, well, I'm trying to live as a writer in the same way that Musashi is trying to live as a swordsman. It's a particular way of being, right? That is more valuable. Like so, you can't transplant that into just any setting.
Yeah,
So, go
it's
ahead, go ahead.
it's certainly it's certainly a character archetype that, though it is a universal and reoccurring, like the purposeless warrior, which is one of my favorite archetypes, is certainly one that has to be put in certain times and places. Um, this is why that there's so much overlap between the Japanese samurai of the post Warring States period and the cowboy of the post Civil War period, and why there's so much interest back and forth between those genres, especially in 20th century film. Uh, you see that in those films, like samurai and cowboy films, both were borrowing from each other very liberally to inspire different plots. Uh, I think Yoyimbo was inspired by Stagecoach, which was an early Western film, and by extension, The Magnificent Seven was inspired by Seven Samurai and stuff. But both are fundamentally about these people who had lived lives of violence and had to find new purpose in life or find a new direction after either they won or they lost, and then they were just like, well, that's over, but what now?
Yeah. All right. We don't have too much time. I wanted to cover some aspects of world building. So I have in my notes here, I mentioned it before, soft versus hard world building. I've also heard these called essentially like narrow and deep versus broad and shallow. Though I think there's intermixing of those of the virtues of those two things if someone's willing to do the work over a long period of time, particularly over a series of books. But in regard to, if I say the words like hard versus soft world building, what does that make you think?
Hard world building, typically, I feel like the story is focused on the world because you are mostly using your story as an avenue to explore a world, versus soft world building, in which the world is there as backdrop for the characters, and you're focused on the characters, but the world just happens to have neat stuff alongside it and stuff that informs what they've got going on, at least in my mind.
Yeah. So, any examples of hard world building that pop into mind?
Immediately, Middle Earth is probably the most like archetypal one in at least fantasy, in which Tolkien wrote it because he wanted to build a world versus explore characters. Dune is also like this, where it's a science fiction story that the writer was thinking the world first and then the characters. Uh,
Yeah. So we see like the laws of physics and nature, or the laws of um, magic, or the history is very much developed in hard world building. It's specific rather than being vague.
yes,
Here's a penultimate hard example. I don't know if you've read it. Probably not, but I have. And I like. I want to mention Shad M. Brooks. This has nothing to do with his recent AI art controversy. I know that got him in a lot of people's eye. But way before that, I'd watched his YouTube videos, so I got his book. I appreciate Shad. I did not think his book was very well written, and I think his book was not very well written because of his execution of very, very hard world building. Like you can say he has a hard magic system, and he does, but he extended that to the world itself. Have you read Shadow? Is it Shadow of a Conqueror or Shadow of the Conqueror? I think.
I have not read Shad's stuff. I am aware that it's got mixed reception from various people, even before like the controversy stuff. Like you were saying, it's like
Yeah, I'll just go
go
ahead.
ahead.
All right. Well, if I want to take it, I want to explain why we could perhaps compare this to Dune, right? Because Dune, I think some of its character dialogue, character work, and prose could use work, but I don't think the execution of the setting is wrong in Dune. I actually think the execution of the setting in Dune is great. Whereas with Shadow of the Conqueror, a big issue with the execution of the setting is it tries to be, I think, hyper realistic more than it tries to convey, and it also tries to be hyper original as opposed to conveying verisimilitude. Which it's kind of skipping around on my notes here, but I think this is going to be relevant. So, um, there are, let's say, very particular laws of physics that in that book that Shad takes a long time to just straight out explain. Um, that is perhaps, let's say, a mistake in prose. I don't think it's a mistake in setting. One thing that I think might be a mistake in setting is, let's say, uh, how he handles the criminal justice system. So he essentially has this league of religious the equivalent of superheroes, right? Because they have to fight these evil monsters every so many years when they come out and fight them back. And there's a particular scene. I know this is going to seem kind of weird and not related to setting, but I think it is. So there's a particular scene where they two characters run around and they fight crime all day, and Shad just like breaks down rough percentages of the, or not percentages, numbers, but you can think of those percentages of the types of criminals that they manage to stop. And like he very flippantly has this like high number of like sexual assault and rapes that get stopped, and also throughout the whole book, rape happens over and over and over and over again. Now, why is this relevant to setting? Here's why, and this is going to be useful as a very extreme example to you listeners out there. So I don't know this, but I have this really big suspicion, knowing about Shad, that he did like autistic levels of probably like crime research and looked at numbers And I'm willing to bet he looked at like urban settings and then looked at like sexual assault numbers and saw, okay, in these particular types of settings, um, that this is the most common crime. So if I'm going to depict crime being, happening with my light powered superheroes fighting crime, here are the rough numbers that I'm going to give. And so he had a very original setting. So he had to exposit and explain lots and lots of elements of it, because the physics on the whole world worked differently. Like instead of it being spherical, like gravity pulled down, and it was like a sphere that teleported you from the. So he had a lot of stuff that he had to explain. And in that setting where he had to explain all this stuff, he then also, so that's originality, which isn't too bad, right? You want some things that aren't necessarily going to convey verisimilitude, that are going to display novelty. But he also input an amount of realism that did not um, that did not actually make the setting feel either more realistic or more compelling. It didn't make the characters feel better. It didn't help the plot. It didn't do anything to the theme. Um, and what it did do is get him in some hot water for some people about his flippancy, uh, with just like throwing rape around every 3 seconds. Um, now, why am I bringing all that up? I'm gonna pause at something at this point. I think that the considerations that we have for setting, are really only useful and relevant if they relate to one of the elements that we have talked about before, right? So the setting has to do something to facilitate genre, and by genre I mean the telos, what it does to the reader. It has to do something to the plot, or it has to do something to the characters, or the theme, or very likely a combination of those things. And I think even if you don't intend for it to do so, it often does. But if it doesn't, if we go for autistic levels of realism with our hard world building, I think that it hurts the story, because the hardness of it is trying to be, in a weird way, too hard, right? It's not touching on the I don't want to call them subjective elements, but the other elements of the story, as opposed to, is this explained with exact real world logic? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it touches on another thing that I particularly harp on whenever I'm discussing stuff like this, especially realism in fiction, is that typically we are reading fiction not for a quote unquote realistic portrayal of a thing, but we are looking in on the most interesting times of a particular character or group of characters' lives, right? We're not reading a story about their daily routine or whatever. Most of the time, there's a few exceptions to this, especially if their lives' daily routine is particularly interesting. But most of the time, we're not just taking, okay, this is what happens every day, and I'm just going to tell a story about that. So whenever you were talking about him using like outright daily statistics of something to like inform how much he portrays something. I don't feel like that's necessarily how statistics work in real life, but but it also isn't very conducive to storytelling.
No, right? And I think if we shift very shortly, with the time we have left, on the softer world building considerations, right? So I think perhaps soft is even the wrong word. I think vague, like vague versus specific, is probably those are probably better words. And I think of, if I'm making the world building soft, what I'm doing is I'm only describing the world or the setting insofar as it's necessary to facilitate one of those other literary elements that we described, right? Like by definition, right? So if you have like a fairy tale, for instance, they typically only go into detail insofar as it's relevant to the other elements of the story. Uh, do you have any particular examples that come to mind that are like this?
Like typically, whenever we talk about this sort of stuff, like the words that I associate with soft world building is show don't tell. It's like the only things that you know about the world are what are immediately relevant to the characters. And in my own writing, and of course because I take inspiration from Pulp Fiction stuff, that tends to be how they handle things. It's like you don't get to know much about the world. You don't get a whole lot of exposition except when it becomes super relevant. And this and sometimes I take this a little too far, in which I just like don't want to explain or exposit anything, and I just want to show a thing. Uh, but this can also be a bad thing, I guess, because then especially if your setting is particularly weird and you're doing a all show no tell sort of approach, you just it just comes off as baffling to some people, and some people really aren't into that.
Yeah, I think there's a balance. You mentioned as an example of hard world building, like Tolkien's like Lord of the Rings series and the books around it. I think that's also a good example of, and I haven't read them, so I'm speaking from ignorance, but I can speak to you, Nate, who's not speaking from ignorance. Do you not think that those books also are a good example in some regard of soft world building elements as well, particularly when it comes to the more fantastical and magical elements of the world?
I think The Hobbit is like that a lot, but also like in terms of magic systems. So like the Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and all that stuff doesn't have a hard magic system, and also no fiction before the advent of like role playing games had them. Uh, well, with a few, very few exceptions, but like 99% of fantasy before the invention of like Dungeons and Dragons didn't have hard magic systems. And it's not something that I think is something super needed most of the time. I mean, you can do that, and some people love that, and I fully support people who enjoy that. But I think that if Tolkien got away with not explaining anything magical at all, you can probably get away with it as a writer if you're a fantasy writer out there worried about that sort of thing. But yeah, certainly, like his approach to the mystic was much more pagan in nature. So, like his core inspiration was Beowulf and Norse sagas, and of course Anglo-Saxon folklore. So in Beowulf, they don't really explain why Grendel is a thing for the most part. They cite lineage from like ancient biblical characters, which is probably something Christians added later, but they don't explain why that this monster is the way it is, or how it's able to do the things it does, or why dragons exist, but they just do.
Yeah,
It
I
was just
actually think.
taken for granted.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, no, it's fine. I think actually, when we talk about genre as telos, like what is this meant to do for the reader? This is something I've gained experience from for doing some. I'm a ghostwriter on a particular project for it's a literary RPG, which I really think should be called like a role-playing game novel, or because the other way around it be anyway, that's not important. The important part is it's outside of my normal. This is the first like RPG type thing I've written. It's essentially the equivalent of a hard magic system, right? Because like it extremely hard, like as hard gets in some sense. And I noticed that the what the reader wants is different, right? So I'm not a typical reader of this genre, and if we're going to call it that, and I would say it's actually setting. And what the setting does is it facilitates the genre. What is the genre then? I think we need a word for this, but I do think that there is this kind of vicarious, um, let's say, a feeling of vicarious competence, right? Like in the same way that you can get, if you're reading an adventure story, it's like you're vicariously living out the adventure, so the experience of going somewhere new and having that freedom. You might think of it as a vicarious autonomy. And I think the harder the magic system is, the more vicariously the reader can live out that feeling of competence and power, right? There's something there. I don't have the exact words for it, um, but I definitely, when the reader can feel like they can logically like like if they had these powers, they would know exactly how to do it to succeed. Therefore, they are now masters of whatever the circumstance they're in the same way that when people play video games and they get good at those, it's essentially mastering a set of closed-ended problems as opposed to having open-ended problem solving. And I think the hard magic system, I don't even think you can blame that on Dungeons and Dragons. I think you can blame that on modern Dungeons and Dragons, like probably 3.5 and after. Uh, and
Yeah,
the reason,
that's probably likely.
well, the reason I say that is because, like you would know, Nate, like original Dungeons and Dragons, the stats are so simple that it requires players to make stuff up, right, on the fly with
Yes.
these few numbers they have, and so yeah, I think that that would be my understanding that the harder your magic is in terms of your setting, if it has magic, the more it plays into the feeling of mastery, if you will, to the reader. And I'll have to think about what genre, because I like to stick with the terms that already exist if we can. But I'm sure that there is some word that gets used for genre that conveys that feeling of mastery and competence vicariously lived out through the reader
Mm,
that exists.
it's not a genre, but we typically refer to people who are really interested in displaying competence over systems as theory crafters, although usually used derogatorily. So the people who are really into 3.5 D&D are typically theory crafters, people who love mixing and matching like things in the hard magic or feat system to develop like unstoppable synergies and stuff. And for some people that is the whole appeal, and I guess that might be a greater appeal of magic systems, like you were saying, like figuring, like learning the magic system and like coming up with theories about how you'd use it and stuff like that. So maybe.
Yeah. All right, Nate, we have gone on long. I don't want to keep you too long. Is there anything in regard to setting that you might have wanted to talk about or wanted to mention that we didn't really get around to?
Not off the top of my head, Gavin.
All right. Well, thank you, Nate. Before we go, I will redirect the readers to my Kickstarter campaign. I'm going to have like an outro at the end, so I won't harp on it. Meanwhile, check out my website, wildilelit.com. There's all kind of stuff there. I almost never mentioned I've got like a blog I do right now on East Asian philosophy. Eventually going to get around to alchemy, but it's taking a while to get through all the East Asian stuff. I also do Wild Owl aphorisms there. So if you want to just look at some, let's say, it's how I vent my frustration with the world in a very attempting to be witty way. So if you want to have a laugh, read those. Those are fun. But more importantly, check out my author reviews. I review indie authors' books. You should go there, read the review, check out their books. They are all working really, really hard. I know a lot of them via the internet, and they are actually very talented writers, quite a few of them more talented than my fellow students in grad school were at the time. Granted, we were still in grad school, and I also was much worse when I was in grad school. So no, I'm not. If you went to school with me, don't feel like I'm insulting you, please. Uh, Other than those reviews, I got my own book on there, Wand Smoke Broken. You can check that out. Weird fantasy fiction. Reads like a Western cross with like a literary novel, if that makes any sense. I don't know if it does. My editing services are there, and I can't think of anything else. So, and Nate, you don't have anything? Any place you want to send people to keep up with your stuff or anything like that?
Not at this point in time.
All right, sometime in the future, you'll be able to check out Nathaniel Cumberledge, and we'll advertise him here on the podcast. But until that time, it was great having you, Nate. Thank you, listeners, for listening to this conversation about setting, and we will see you next time. Greetings, friends. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching or listening between May 27th and June 26th of 2023, I have an important announcement. A Kickstarter campaign is currently underway to fund the covers for the upcoming Wand Smoke short story series, Tales from the Labyrinth. Please like, comment, and share this video or podcast to help spread the message as far as possible. And if you'd like to donate, click the Kickstarter link in the description to support the campaign. you'd be helping fund 5 book covers. That's 5 releases over the course of the year and 5 steps closer to bringing a dream into reality. Thank you so much, friends.